Welcome back to my channel, Celebes. Please share and subscribe and press the bell icon for new updates. The top 6 actors Lee Van Cleef hated the most. Lee Van Cleef was born as Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9th, 1925 in a town called Somerville, New Jersey. His mom and dad were working people who came from Holland long ago. When he was young, nobody could guess he would become a famous movie star someday. After he finished high school, he joined the Navy and fought bravely in World War II. He worked on a special ship that looked for underwater bombs in the Pacific Ocean. Being in the military taught him to be tough and disciplined, which helped him a lot when he started acting in movies. After the war ended, Van Cleef came back home and worked different jobs to make money. He was an accountant who worked with numbers and also painted houses. But his life changed when he got a part in a play in his town. People who worked for Hollywood movie companies saw him act and thought he was really good. His intense way of acting caught their attention right away. His first movie role was in 1952 in a film called High Noon. He played a bad guy who didn't say any words, but people remembered him anyway. Even though it was a small part, his looks made a big impression on everyone who watched. Van Cleef had sharp cheekbones that stuck out, a nose that looked like a hawk's beak, and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He didn't look like the usual handsome movie stars that Hollywood liked back then. But being different turned out to be his best thing. During the 1950s and early 1960s, he usually played the bad guy in cowboy movies and crime shows. His characters were often criminals, outlaws, or cold-blooded killers. Even though he wasn't the main star during this time, people always remembered his acting. Movies like Kansas City Confidential in 1952, The Big Combo in 1955, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962 showed how good he was at being scary, even when he didn't talk much. Sadly, in 1958, he was in a terrible car crash that hurt his knee badly. For a while, it looked like his acting career might be over because of his injury. But the 1960s brought something amazing to Van Cleef's life that made him a movie legend. An Italian movie director named Sergio Leone chose him to be in a cowboy movie called For a Few Dollars More in 1965. He acted alongside Clint Eastwood in this film. Van Cleef played Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a tough bounty hunter who wanted revenge. His acting was so good that it surprised everyone who watched, and all the movie critics, too. This movie showed that he could be a leading man, which was rare for actors who usually played bad guys. He worked with Eastwood again in The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly in 1966. In this movie, he played Angel Eyes, the mean and calculating bad character in Leone's famous trio. The film was a huge success and made Van Cleef famous all around the world. Unlike many actors who stopped getting work when cowboy movies became less popular, Van Cleef loved making Italian westerns and kept doing them throughout the 1960s and 1970s. These movies included Sabata in 1969, Death Rides a Horse in 1967, The Big Gun Down in 1966, and Day of Anger in 1967. Each role made people think of him as a master of being quiet, but dangerous and morally complicated. His movie personality was known for quiet authority and power. He spoke softly but always seemed dangerous. Unlike other cowboy stars who were loud and heroic, Van Cleef's characters were often thoughtful, smart, and driven by their own ideas of what was right and wrong, even if they walked on the wrong side of the law. He became a symbol of the anti-hero type that came to define modern Western movies. People respected him not just for his acting, but for how he seemed to really become his characters with quiet honesty that came from personal hardship and experience. In the 1980s, Van Cleef tried different kinds of roles on TV and action movies. He starred in the cult classic movie Escape from New York in 1981 as the mean police commissioner Hull. He also took the main role in the NBC TV show The Master in 1984, where he played a retired ninja master. Though these later projects had different levels of success, they showed he could change with new trends in entertainment. Lee Van Cleef's personal life had several important relationships that happened during different parts of his journey through Hollywood and beyond. His first marriage was to Patty Ruth Cale in 1943, a relationship that started during the crazy years of World War II. At that time, Van Cleef was still new to acting, having recently changed from his service in the United States Navy to the world of stage and film. Patty Ruth became his loyal companion during these important years and stayed with him as he began to make a name for himself in the business. Together, they raised a family and had 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. Being a father and having a growing acting career put a lot of pressure on Van Cleef, who often felt torn between working on movie sets and taking care of his young family. Even though they shared history and spent many years together, their relationship became strained by the difficulties that can come from living in the public eye. In 1958, after 15 years of marriage, and Patty got divorced, ending his first and longest marriage. 2 years later, in 1960, Van Cleef married again, this time to Joan Marjorie Drain. Joan came into his life when his acting career was going through ups and downs. He had experienced both good and bad times in Hollywood and was still getting better from a serious car accident in the late 1950s that almost ended his movie career. Joan gave him emotional support and friendship as he worked to get back on his feet in the business. This marriage lasted for 14 years and covered an important time when Van Cleef had a major comeback in his career, especially in Europe, where he became internationally famous, starring in iconic spaghetti westerns like For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Joan stayed by his side as he reached a level of fame he had never known before. But like his first marriage, this relationship also ended in divorce in 1974. The reasons why they separated stayed mostly private, but it's likely that the continuing pressures of fame, traveling a lot, and the intensity of life in the entertainment business played a part. In 1976, Lee Van Cleef got married for the 3rd and final time, this time to Barbara Havilone. By this time, Van Cleef had firmly made himself a global star, especially loved in Europe for his commanding presence on screen and unique features that made him memorable and often scary in Western movies. Barbara became not only his wife, but also a constant and stabilizing presence during the later years of his life and career. She stayed with him during his final years of movie work and supported him through various health problems, including ongoing issues from his earlier car accident and lifelong smoking habit. Their marriage lasted until his death in 1989, making Barbara the widow of a man whose legacy continues to live on through his legendary performances. Her loyalty and devotion were clear in her continued efforts to honor his memory after his death. She is often remembered fondly by fans as the woman who was there for Van Cleef when the final curtain fell. Lee Van Cleef, the tough gunslinger with the unmistakable presence, earned his reputation as one of Hollywood's most unforgettable tough guys. While he worked with some of the greatest stars in movies, not all of those partnerships were friendly. Known for his blunt nature and no-nonsense professionalism, Van Cleef didn't put up with fools or big egos easily. Behind the scenes, he reportedly fought with several fellow actors because of personality conflicts, artistic disagreements, or pure hatred. Here are 6 actors Lee Van Cleef is said to have hated the most. Lee Van Cleef's relationship with John Wayne was complicated, to say the least. On the surface, both were towering icons of the Western movie type. But underneath that movie common ground were deep differences in personality, politics, and professional respect. While Wayne represented the all-American, flag-waving, studio-backed cowboy ideal, Van Cleef carved out his image through grittier European-made spaghetti westerns that enjoyed moral uncertainty and movie realism. Van Cleef was a craftsman, a man who built his career from the bottom up, starting with uncredited roles and bit parts as villains. He was angry about how Wayne, backed by powerful people like John Ford, dominated the genre with a sense of entitlement. According to crew members on overlapping studio lots, Van Cleef found Wayne pompous and dismissive, especially when the Duke reportedly called European westerns cheap cowboy flicks. Van Cleef, whose fame exploded in Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the ugly saw that as a personal insult. Though they never starred together, there were rumors that Van Cleef turned down a minor role in a John Wayne film simply because he didn't want to be second best to a studio puppet. In private, he called Wayne Hollywood's mascot and avoided any interaction with him on red carpets or press tours. The rivalry, though never openly publicized, was well known among Western insiders. 2. Charles Bronson, the battle of the brooding tough guys. Charles Bronson and Lee Van Cleef were often thought of as cut from the same cloth, rugged, quiet, and intense screen presences who could carry a film with a single angry look. But Van Cleef reportedly got annoyed at the constant comparisons and had an underlying anger toward Bronson, particularly in the 1970s when both were at the height of their European fame. The breaking point may have come when Bronson got the lead role in Once Upon a Time in the West, a Sergio Leone epic that Van Cleef had wanted to be in. While Leone had previously favored Van Cleef, he chose Bronson instead for the lead. Van Cleef allegedly took this as a professional betrayal and questioned Leone's loyalty. In later interviews, Van Cleef subtly made fun of Bronson's wooden acting and once joked that a block of granite could show more emotion. On set, when the two briefly crossed paths during overlapping productions in Spain, tension was said to be so thick that producers deliberately changed their shooting schedules. Despite both actors being serious professionals, Van Cleef considered Bronson's quick rise an example of Hollywood rewarding style over substance, which Van Cleef, trained in theater and method acting, found insulting. 3. Clint Eastwood from Student to Enemy. Perhaps the most surprising person on this list is Clint Eastwood, the man who helped lift Lee Van Cleef to international fame. Their work together in For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was legendary. But behind the scenes, their relationship was far more troubled than it appeared on screen. At first, Van Cleef admired Eastwood's calm manner and ambition. But as Eastwood's fame exploded in the 1970s, Van Cleef felt thrown away. He believed Eastwood had used their partnerships as a stepping stone, and then turned his back on the actors and directors who had helped him rise. Eastwood's change from actor to director made the gap even wider, especially when he didn't cast Van Cleef in later westerns like High Plains Drifter or Pale Rider, roles Van Cleef thought were perfect for. Rumors suggest that Van Cleef even reached out to Eastwood's production company for possible partnerships in the early 1980s, but was politely ignored. In interviews, Van Cleef was diplomatic but firm. Clint's gone Hollywood, he once said. He's traded in dust and grit for cameras and cocktails. In the dusty corners of movie history, these rivalries add yet another layer to the mystique of the man who was above all the bad and proudly so. Despite suffering from heart disease from the 1970s and having a pacemaker installed in the 1980s, Van Cleef continued to work in films until his death on December 16, 1989. He collapsed from a heart attack in his home in Oxnard, California.